It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Mark Elvin, who I've known over the years in various capacities. And Mark, I always start by asking when and where a person is born. So
the historian's answer is very near here, Wilbraham. Well, nearly. I was born in Cambridge, but my first year and a half in life was spent there, but I don't remember it. All I remember a few photographs, particularly of a pet lamb that I'm told I had, which got bigger much faster than I did and used to knock me down, so I would apparently fling myself onto the grass in front of the onset of this creature. But this is all hearsay. In a sense...
When was this?
38.
1938.
In a sense, the life I remember, if you like, the birth of consciousness, is in America, in San Francisco. It's a completely different environment. Because my father sent me and my mother, who was American, to live with my grandparents in San Francisco. And so I grew up until about the age of 6, I guess, almost 7, in California.
From what age? What age did you go there?
I would have gone there probably in 39, end of 39.
So you're about a year old.
About over a year. And my mother, who was a clinical psychologist, took a job in the juvenile court there, which in due course turned into the assignment from hell. She's amazingly calm and capable. And of course she only talked to me about it when I was about 25. But just after the Americans came into the war, an enormous number of troops poured through the Golden Gate and then out to the war with Japan. And the number of Lolita-aged girls who were in trouble was almost unhandleable. My mother's job, which I knew nothing about as I played with my toy guns in the nursery, was to decide what should be done with these girls, some as young as 11, once the judicial process had had its way. And I never dreamt of what was going on. My chief sadness was when her legal clerk, a lady called Mary Caldwell, who was special to me because she had a gear shift in which an illuminated sailboat sailed across the knob, that was Marie, suddenly disappeared to sew ships with a welding gun in the shipyards in the north of the bay, organised by the automobile magnate Henry Kaiser. And she was no longer around. I didn't know much about what she was doing, but it was not confidential. I had no idea really what was going on at the time in the court, and I only had a rough idea of the war. I was taken around an aircraft carrier, for example, and my chief concern was for the poor rats who, I was told, I didn't see it happen, ran up the mooring hawsers, and then they reached one of these inverted coolie hats, couldn't turn around and fell off and got drowned. That upset my tender sensibilities. I had no idea what these young men were going off to do. Long afterwards I did.
Why you presumably sent there because because of the war?
I was sent there because of the war, and my father was disappeared.
What was he doing?
The first 3 months he had what he said was, with a smile, the worst non-combatant job in the government. He had to write the letters to the widows of those who died in the Battle of Britain. He was in the Air Ministry. Because he put in tiny human touches, he was promptly, when this was discovered, taken off that job. And it was discovered he had 2 other abilities. One was a knowledge of America, so he became very much involved in relations with America, particularly trying to prepare a bit the British public and the government for what would hope would be an alliance of some sort. And the Japanese did his job for him. He wrote a temporary bestseller called Men of America, which was later on, after the war, translated into Japanese, interestingly. But the other was the one part he never talks about. My younger son has come to the conclusion that what was not spent in the Ministry of Information was mostly spent being the man behind the minister. At various conferences he had an extraordinary knowledge of the world, and which is why he later fitted so easily into UNESCO. But that is the only bit where he, unlike I think many people, actually kept his mouth shut. He was garrulous, brilliant raconteur, but about this we never heard. Yeah, war is great for small boys, and they don't understand at that distance what's really going on. In San Francisco, I remember much later on, when coffee was rationed, there was a most bitter protest. You can put that into the British context and see why it seemed very odd when I look back afterwards. But, I mean, also the impact at a personal level was that my grandfather, for example, was the minister of the first Unitarian church in San Francisco, had a very friendly old Japanese gentleman who looked after the church and was a great favourite of mine. I think I was a favourite of his. And then one day, as you will have anticipated, he disappeared into some kind of internment. And I never saw him again, and nobody would tell me where he'd gone, which even at that age worried me because I knew something was wrong. But it wasn't explained what the Americans were doing for security reasons. And he sort of then got engraved inside me just as a memory of something that went wrong. But otherwise it was a very straightforward childhood with some odd lessons in it. I don't want to go on too long about this.
Well, do,
phase.
Because you've written a 3-volume children's
yes, but not with these things in it. I'll take just one that I never quite... I'll give you two. One nice and one a bit nasty and one a bit nice that will counterbalance, I hope. Both of these were at preschools or proto-kindergartens. The first, they wanted, I understood, to introduce something a bit more realistic into what we did. So I was presented when I got there, I'm guessing I'm 4, maybe 5, but probably 4, with a can with water in it and a 4-inch paintbrush, and told to paint the wooden slat fence outside in the sunshine. So I set to work and I carefully painted the wood with water. By the time I got to the second, well, probably the third slat, it was drying off. So I went in and protested. I was told not to be silly, and that made me very angry. In fact, the row became so bad that my mother had to be called, and she managed diplomatically to settle it, and I was never asked to do such a silly thing again. But this, of course, in retrospect, was a wonderful parable for the real world, and much work. But that occurred later. But I never forgot that, because I began to learn that grown-ups could be incredibly stupid. And that was one of the first cases I remember where the grown-ups seemed to me to be being incredibly stupid and not backing down. Now, the nice story was I had another preschool school, a sort of general teacher, but mostly an art teacher called Miss Sunny. That really was at least the name she travelled under, and it suited her very well. And I did trees and houses and all the usual things, and children and animals. Not very well, but I did them. But I always did the sky, as I gather many kids do, as a solid line of blue across the top of the paper. And after a while she said, John, I was called John then. I changed my name later. Or rather, I used my second name later. If you look at the sky, doesn't it all come down and fill in all the gaps between the leaves and the roofs and things? I said, maybe. She said, why don't you try doing it like that? And then I looked and I said, I paint the sky at the top because that is where it is. And now she didn't lose her temper. She just smiled and she said, that's fine by me, but give it a try sometime if you are interested. Well, sometime later I did, and I confessed that she was right. And she remained a great favourite of mine because she was a reasonable grown-up. She was helpful. She didn't bully, but she told me something. And after a while I thought about it and decided that I would also do sky that filled up all the little gaps. So that perhaps is enough about that, though I can talk probably till you go to sleep about life there. The chief point about it, of course, is the contrast with Britain after the war when I came back. In fact, I came back slightly before the war was over in a meat steamer, which many British children travelled in at some point or other, called the Rangatiki, New Zealand meat steamer, which travelled in the centre of the convoy for protection against the U-boats. I don't know why my father brought us back quite so early, though he was very aware that the war was going to end in our favour, but it hadn't yet ended in our favour.
About 44, was it?
Yeah.
Mm.
And at any rate, I suffered a terrible pang of guilt for my behaviour there, because I made a very beautiful little paper boat and brightly coloured, and was caught by the steward dropping it over the side of the boat. And he gave me a terrible, really, I realised he was deadly serious talking to. He said, if you leave that in the water floating around, the Germans will see it, and they'll know we've been going by. I put the rubbish into a weighted container every evening, and I drop it over the side of the boat, and it goes straight to the bottom where nobody can see it. He said, don't you ever do that again, because you're risking people's lives. And I thought, oh my God. Now, this again was because he described things. This was a reasonable grown-up, and I was desperately anxious that we would not be attacked because of my paper boat bobbing up and down on the waves. I took it very seriously. Mm. I don't know how serious it was in one incident, but the logic was perfectly clear. And he hadn't tried to punish me, he just gave me a heck of a warning. And why? So folks understood, and I behaved extremely well afterwards.
I want to now take you back a bit. People sometimes, you mentioned one set of grandparents, but are there any other ancestors or grandparents who are important for you? Not
really, apart from my other grandparents and some uncles, a couple of uncles, very important. But at that point I only knew my mother's father, who was a bit overawing. Saturdays you had to observe complete silence in the house because he was writing his sermon. It's a familiar problem, I think, that children of the manse have, but at any rate, I really related much better to my grandmother. I was in awe of the grandfather, but my grandmother, who was distantly related, she told us, and she was very truthful, though we've never made it certain, as a right from Ohio to the Wrights, who had invented powered flight. It looks as if they could have been a somewhat removed cousin, but Diane, who's a genealogist, has not yet pinned that down. I think the family, understandably, is a little bit unhappy. She respects this about too much poking around. But at any rate, she was interested in, above all, birds and vegetables, and I grew a vegetable garden under her supervision. First vegetables I grew, which must have been 4. I grew chard and radishes, and then various other things that were, and looked at the birds in the garden. We occasionally had hummingbirds. I remember watching a hummingbird flying backwards. It wasn't common, but it did happen. And thinking, oh, something extraordinary. She was a good cook. What I didn't know, and only learned this year, was that my grandfather had been a minister too, unfaithful to her during a transatlantic holiday voyage to go to some conference or other in Europe, with his church organist. And suddenly I discovered I had a sort of cousin, Tom Stone.
Are you happy for this to go on the web?
Yeah, absolutely happy. Yeah. Wonderful guy, who wrote to me with all the details, which had only been just recently released to him, because the older ladies in the family who did know this and kept it deadly secret decided that since his father, who would have been very hurt by it, had died, they would now tell his son. So suddenly I discovered that I wasn't, as it were, on my own, and we've been in correspondence since then. But my grandfather was a very moral, authoritarian chap, and this would of course have smashed his career to pieces. It was kept quiet, but I'm quite certain, in retrospect, that my grandmother knew. There was a kind of subdued sadness about her, which impressed me very early on, and I didn't know why. She found relief in the birds and marvellous little Californian bird like the ruby-crowned kinglet. I mean, incredible. Imagine a wren with a red crown on. And so that now, for the first time in 70 years plus, makes sense. Now, where did you want to go from there?
Well,
I could take various tracks.
What about the other grandparents?
Well, okay, that fits in with the uncles too.
Yeah.
My father's father was a lay preacher. I always had understood Methodist, but actually I think it is Congregationalist. I think there was a misinformation. But he was a lay preacher. He was rather rigid, but a very principled man, and I think in this case genuinely. And he was a trade union leader. Had some rather interesting stories about trade unionism, saying his hardest job as a leader of the clerks' union had been to organise the offices of the railway unions personnel. Unions running the railways workforce, or in charge of their
This is in England.
did not want to have their clerks and their offices unionised, and it was quite a struggle. He, in the end, became a member of the London County Council. He became, at least for 1 year, the president of the TUC, the Trade Union Congress. So there's a very deep streak, which didn't die in me either, which regards trade unions responsibly run as incredibly important parts of society, and particularly not the big events, but the endless day-to-day, patient, largely confidential battle against the mistreatment of people who are workers. And also a very real sense that, I should add, that if the business or office is not flourishing, then it's not to the good of the people who work there. It was a very balanced and cautious and thoughtful man. My grandmother was tiny. My father's mother was tiny. I should call Dolly. She was probably about 4'11". And it turned out later on that she was in fact a free thinker, but had kept her mouth shut while my grandfather was alive. But something of her attitude clearly got into my father and his two brothers. My grandfather died fairly young, by 67, perhaps not young for those days, but compared to the others who all died in their 80s, he died young. And I remember knowing he was going to die by looking at him when he sort of sat in a chair having Benja's food and had a shawl around his shoulders. It didn't look good. But he was, in fact, a very remarkable man, and I must have inherited something of his attitude towards society. There were my grandmother, as I say, I can only perhaps sum up her character, but about the only time in her and my life, and she lost her temper with me, it was very near the end. She was living at that time, Leon C, in my second uncle's house, and I didn't like to be, even then, early 80s, thought of as a burden. And I went in full of righteousness when staying there and did all the washing up after for lunch and breakfast. I was just finishing when she came in and gave me a tremendous scolding. I thought, have I washed it up wrong? Is it not properly rinsed? I thought I was trained. Then she calmed down and explained. She said, I am living here, she said, simply on the effect of the charity of Uncle George and Aunt Peg, and there's very little left that I can still do. But washing up is one thing I can do, and you've got to let me do it. And I suddenly had awe-stricken respect for this self-discipline, and I apologised at once, and of course she forgave me. But there was a burst of real anger which I'd actually never seen. Quite incredible at the age of, 82 or 3. She died 84. And so she was a character, but I didn't know her very deeply, unlike my American grandmother. My two uncles are interesting people. Uncle George was the de facto, not de jure, founder of the old Associated Cinematograph and Television Technicians Union, the ACTTU, which for a time had extremely powerful control over the manufacture, production and showing of films made in Britain. He was a man who exuded willpower the way a boxer exudes strength. He went eye to eye with people like Spiros Skouras, and I don't know with Sam Goldwyn, but certainly his representatives. He took on power, and he very often won. He was a very determined guy, with a wonderful sense of humour, but he suffered a lot from the nervous strain. But the sense of humour was what he is remembered for, I think. I'll give you just two sort of examples, one light-hearted, one rather fascinating. He always took bribes. He always accepted any bribe he was offered. He immediately declared what he'd received on the big notice board in the main union office in Soho Square. One fur coat. He then circularised his deputies around all the branches, saying, which of your members would have a use for this? So if somebody wrote in and said, well, George, so-and-so's just died and his widow would, I think, love a new fur coat. George would look carefully around, ring up, see if he'd missed anybody, and then he'd send the fur coat off with the compliments of the union. He took every bribe, he declared every bribe, it never went to him personally, ever. And the other thing was that he was attacked by one of the Sunday papers, which I don't know if it's still around. I have a vague memory that it was called the Sunday Pictorial. If that's still in existence, please don't accept this as anything more than a hazy memory. But what happened afterwards is more than a memory. He was accused of being a card-carrying communist. He was very left-wing. He was not a communist. And he sued them. And he won a lot of money. What did he do with that money? That's where the humour comes in. He took a very well-publicised trip to Sochi on the Black Sea in the old Soviet Union and had a very deluxe holiday and brought back a lot of caviar and vodka and other things with him for the family. I know, because that's my first taste of caviar, both kinds. And he was just rubbing it in that he wasn't going to be intimidated by this kind of behaviour. He was a great character. I suppose I also got when I lived in Glasgow much later, an insight into his methods of negotiating, because he'd come up for some meeting in Glasgow and we'd arranged to go and pick him up, bring him back, give him a bed. Well, I probably picked him up around midnight, a bit later maybe even, and the meeting had finished. He seemed to be quite extraordinarily drunk. I won't give on tape an imitation, but it really was burp and slurp and wobble. Well, he came back and we sat him down and gave him a coffee. And then, of course, we got somehow onto the one real disagreement that my wife, then wife, and I had with him. We thought the world of him as a person, but we did think that his union, which was later on changed his policy, but not under his leadership, towards people who made small budget films, particularly in arts, anthropology and the sciences, did not get a fair deal. They did not need to have a special electrician for putting the plug in and out, and many other rules that the ACT demanded. And somehow we got into this, and then where was my drunken uncle? Once the arguments got going, suddenly he began to sit up. The slur left his voice. He leant slightly forward on his elbow, and he was talking lucidly, like a trade union negotiator should, and disagreeing with every word. We believed what we said was true, and we agreed to differ, but I realised that the secret of his technique was to feign drunkenness with a tremendously hard head and stay absolutely stony sober inside. It was an extraordinary lesson. His humour? Well, I once, in the context...
Mark, we'll have to move on, I think.
Can
probably.
I tell one anecdote?
One anecdote. And
I mean, I can go forever, as you know, but the humour was of this sort, that he was being attacked by us again, politely but firmly, for not looking after small budget artistic and scientific filmmakers, when he said, "Mark, we are reasonable people." I said, "Uncle George, come on. If we were making feature film or a documentary for commercial display in British cinemas of the ascent of Everest. We are by union rules required to have 2 of our technicians on the summit. And he leant forward and said, we would be reasonable. We wouldn't insist on more than 1. Well, that was the kind of rough-hewn guy it was. I did some negotiating in Australia later on in my life, not at a very high level compared to that, but that was a useful model. Now,
let's get to your parents.
You like my parents next?
Tell me something about their
look,
character.
I must tell you about my other uncle.
Okay, quickly.
Very quickly. If this story is true, well, I can only say that it was told to me as if it were. If the Foreign Office rings you up and says wrong, you can say I apologise. But the story is as follows. He got trapped in the Soviet Union when the Second World War developed, when Hitler developed the Second Front. And he went straight to the embassy, where my grandfather did know the ambassador. And he was given the job as second assistant night watchman at the embassy. Okay, he was very happy with this. And then there was the embassy chess tournament. Now, 2 points. My uncle was not a great chess player, but he was not half bad. I was a better player, but he was not hopeless by any means. Then the Soviet Union and Great Britain arranged over the radio chess matches, and it was necessary to have Russian-speaking, at least one representative in the room to see who followed the rules, who also knew chess. And at that point there was a problem, nobody to go. But there had just previously been a British embassy chess tournament. It probably had moved at this point just to Sverdlovsk, actually, the embassy. At any rate, embarrassingly for the diplomats, my uncle won. Now, you cannot have your assistant night watchman thrashing top political secretaries in the embassy. It just isn't done, or wasn't done. And so the ambassador suddenly saw the way to solve both problems. He summoned my uncle and said, Elvin, sir, you play chess, yes. You speak Russian? Badly, sir. What's your past experience? Well, I used to work as a floor manager for Alexander Korda. Later Sir Alexander Korda. Okay, he said, you've got a job now. Firstly, promotion, however. You are now the Assistant Secretary for Culture. Uncle sort of didn't believe his ears. And you are going to look after the refereeing and umpiring relationships with the forthcoming radio chess match. And so he did. I don't believe there is any comparable promotion in the history of the British diplomatic service, which, if that's true, can match it. I only had it from him, and he knew all the top Russian players, Latvianik, Bronstein, so forth. He knew them because he worked with them. So there was a foundation of something there. Well, this was a man who brought a Russian ballerina, Violetta Prokhorova, better known as Violetta Elvin, back to Britain after the war. How did he do it? It's now been confirmed by her. She now lives in Naples. She's married somebody else later on and is now widowed. That it was a direct intervention of Attlee at my grandfather's request with Stalin. That's how you get a top ballerina out of Russia to marry her. Probably no other way possible. So he was in his own way a very interesting man. I won't talk longer about him, but there are many, many stories which always touch on the edge of the unbelievable and then turn out to have something that is correct. Now you wanted to move on.
Your parents, tell me their character and how that might have influenced.
Well, my father was always a man I greatly respected, was always very proper and careful and cautious and responsible. For example, he and my mother never travelled on the same aeroplane until I was 21, so that I would never be a total orphan. I only found that out later. But not seeing him, except for a very brief visit during the war, meant that I reached the age of, on the edge of 7, without knowing him. I knew he was there. So my bonding was very much with my mother, who was quite different. My mother was an extraordinary person and went in very deep indeed. I was respected my father, but he was not on the surface ever interested in what I did. He was working firstly at higher education as the principal of Ruskin College in Oxford, when Oxford actually asked him if he wanted Ruskin to be incorporated into the university, something I don't think happened, or could have happened later. and he talked about it with the people there and decided against it. But in his day, at Ruskin, people like Bertrand Russell and Joseph Needham would come willingly to talk publicly, and the place would be full of people from the main university at Ruskin College. A very remarkable man. But with me, his relations are summed up by when I'd done a painting or I'd written something and I'd show it to him, he'd look at it briefly and say, "Very fine." Later on, I got in the habit of embarrassing him by saying, "Would you look at this? But please don't say it's very fine." So he found other things to say. But he nonetheless said some equivalent of very fine. He wasn't really interested, at least on the surface. Then he went to UNESCO, as the E in UNESCO, in the days when it was still a remarkable idealistic organisation, not a way of finding jobs for people who had political debts in too many other countries. And that meant we had to go and live in Paris, and I saw a little bit more of him there, but mostly I just remembered his table talk, which was brilliant. But he had very little interaction with me, even so, although he was very responsible and very kind in a rather distant way. My mother was quite a different matter. My mother was certainly the first woman to get a first in psychology at Cambridge, which was her second degree. She had Stanford before that. She was one of the especially gifted children studied by Terman at Stanford throughout the rest of their lives. The project carried on until very recently. She was the scientific part of my background, and although she was basically in therapeutic work, her great speciality being the effects after the war of localized lesions in the brain, in which she was, for a very long time after Richie Russell, with whom she worked, regarded as the most important person to refer to. And she was part of the team that first put agrammatism on the screen, shall we say, as a real phenomenon with tests to determine its presence. Agrammatism, of course, means having a vocabulary, maybe even quite a large one, several thousand words, but not being able to string them together in a reliable and consistent order, not even inventing your own sequences, but having a kind of random mixture of perfectly meaningful syllables, or perfectly meaningful words, I should say, but no consistent structure. I think the last time I talked to her, she said there were probably about 4 cases a year in Britain, if that, mostly motorcyclists. But during the war, there was a great number of these people, and she spent most of her years before we moved to Paris, and some of her time after she came back, we came back, trying to find out, above all, how to diagnose the specifics, because the agrammatism can come in very different patterns and degrees, and try to work out and help find some kind of useful employment for such people. So I gained from her a very acute awareness of the importance of science in society, and eventually, as a historian, I turned more and more to saying the great gap in history are people who can bring together the proper skills of a social scientist, anthropologist, and social historian on the one hand, and some sense of the science, because there are plenty of histories of science written for scientists about the great steps and so forth, and there are histories of a social nature, but there is not enough of a meeting ground in the middle, and not enough people working, as I was to, in history primarily, actually could understand some of it. Well, I was from her that, and I was often her that I gained a sense of its importance, and I was for quite a while, in our time at Oxford, in the late 40s, an occupant of the Institute of Experimental Psychology, now been demolished and I think largely replaced by the engineering building, as one of the first people on whom a new test or a new piece of machinery, a tachistoscope of a new kind and new things, would be tested. So I was very familiar with what was going on in these places, as it were, as a laboratory rat that happened to be human.
Were you the only child?
I was an only child, which was basically Hitler's fault.
Mm.
I did beg my mother to have a brother or sister, She said, even if we did, she said, and I think there was a lot of financial pressure at first, which made it difficult, would have made it difficult, and she had also a professional job to do, you would not actually be that child's brother or sister, you'd be a junior uncle. Because by then you'd probably be 12, 11 or 12 or whatever it was. And I forget the age when she told me this, and she said, really, it doesn't, you lost it, in effect. It wouldn't make sense.
You've talked about her professional abilities, but in her relationship to you, was she warm and... Fantastic.
But we didn't really even need that, because we got... When you have an only parent and an only child, in the sense if it works, it works to the point where really you don't have a problem. I mean, I never quarrelled with my parents ever, basically. I mean, differences of opinion, at least after a very early age with my father, because it just didn't seem appropriate. That probably was helped by being at a boarding school the later part, because going to my parents for 1/3 of the year, mostly in Paris when I got older, was like having a fantastic holiday. But my relationships were extremely easy, and she was interested in what I did, and she was good for intelligent conversation to within a very... until the last time I saw her. I didn't quite get back from Australia in time to be present in hospital when she died. I missed it by about 24 hours. But apparently she was completely lucid even as she was going under, and turned to a lady called Joyce, who'd been an enormous help in the house when my father was ill, and just apparently her last words were completely lucid and blunt. Joyce, look after Lionel, please. And Joyce did. She's gone now, but she was fantastic. But she even when her body was falling apart, the lucidity and willpower were quite, and yet it was not harsh, it was gentle willpower, were quite striking. I remember going to see her once near the end when I'd come to visit from Australia, and she was like a glove puppet. There was a head that was working, and there was a body that hung a bit like a limp glove puppet's flexible body. Oh God. Then I looked in her eyes, and they came straight back. And I thought, she's good for a bit of time yet. She sometimes took 2 hours to dress properly in the morning, because it was very slow and painful, but she would not move until she'd done a good job. She always did. She had a remarkable willpower. She kept being re-employed. Every time she retired from a hospital job, there'd be a phone call. I say every time, well, the last 3 times. And she was still working at 78, 79, when the team she was with broke up, and she didn't go back. But what's interesting about that is that it wasn't just the team breaking up. She decided, looking at herself very clinically, that her eyesight wasn't good enough to drive home in the dark from the New Addenbrooke's hospital where she worked. So she said, okay, that is over. I'm not safe on the roads at night. I can still drive in the daylight, but not in the dark. And so she, in effect, just dismissed herself after talking to people.
That's
typical.
Yeah, she sounds lovely, but yeah. I'm afraid we'll have to hurry on quickly, because we're
I'm sorry, you
well
must,
into our time.
I think, Alan, you must pick a few topics and I'll give
Well, I'm just going to keep moving on, but can we now move on to, I mean, you return when you're about 4 or 5, 6, but let's skip straight to the Dragon School, if you don't mind, if that's okay. I mean, we were both at the Dragon School, but I was there later than you, so whatever you'd like to say about your experience there.
Well, I think that from the point of view of the topic that you're interested in, which is, if you like, the formation of a somewhat personal worldview or way of going about things, was there that it really dawned on me that I was different, because I come back from California. It was quite a long way ahead of Britain in some respects. Ahead must carry quotation marks, but I found people doing things, gauging things very, very differently. And I was extremely rebellious and utterly unpersuadable. You've heard in private stories, which I won't repeat now. There's no reason why they shouldn't be repeated, but I got beaten a lot and regarded this as just ridiculous. I carried it off and got great peer group adulation, which only made me behave badly again. I was very bright, which is the reason they tolerated me. If I think I've been in their place, I'd have asked me to be removed. And in the end, I only stopped behaving because exactly what Jock Lynham, the acting headmaster, the real headmaster, did when I said, "Oh, you don't mean that, sir." I do mean it, Elvin.
That's expelling you.
Expelling me, yes. Well, after that I behaved, more or less. But internally and mentally I didn't behave. But it went from physical misbehaviour, which I didn't really have much trouble in stopping. Some appalling stories. I never believed that I would lose an argument when I took it on. If I took on an argument and I was beaten, I accepted that with the masters. But if I was right, I never changed. And I remember the extraordinary bewilderment of Wilding, a very good classics teacher, that I remembered an argument we'd had for a year, and I came back at him when there was an opportunity and said, "I still don't see why." He beat me again, and then he gave in. I don't think children that remember arguments in detail for a year are commonplace, even though there's some very brilliant people there. I dug in, and that was me, I dug in. But I would yield to an argument. And the thing that was most interesting, though, was that I accepted that these people knew maths beyond what I could ever hope to understand, classics beyond what I could perhaps hope to understand, but not for a long time yet, and many other things which I had a great deal to learn and did very happily, but not religion. Well, exposed to a variety of religions, and none, because both my parents were quite agnostics. They were not, in any sense, atheists, in a digressive sense at all, not Dawkins. My mother, when I asked her about it, just said, "Mark," she said, I changed my name to Mark by then, my second name. It's just not intellectually responsible to believe in a revealed religion. And that sums her up. It wasn't a great sort of agony or a great triumph. Neither. It just wasn't intellectually responsible. And that tells you a lot about her attitude. And she could talk in detail if you wanted to, but I knew what she meant. But I was fascinated at the Dragon. Well, I would normally expect totally to be overwhelmed in anything like maths or classics. I could usually, with my friend Francis Hope, were very important, the two of us, aided and abetted each other.
Slow
down. I had a very good friend who later on died in the Orly air crash. He was a very bright and remarkable person who had enormous hopes for the future, Francis Hope, but who got killed there. So we both had this point of view, and we tended to help each other out and back each other up and so forth. But I was amazed by the fact that the one area where I would normally, or rather I should say we, would virtually always win was on religion and philosophical issues related to religion, and I was genuinely interested. I wasn't trying to do anything demonic or satanic. That would have horrified me. But I was puzzled by the fact that I was told nonsense. Other masters might be perhaps wrong or have something I didn't agree with, but nonsense, no. This was nonsense. And this contrast fascinated me. So I was already, by the age of 11, in some ways you could say, someone who took as his guide Bertrand Russell's work that was accessible to me, beginning with unpopular essays. And I suppose that meant that my sense of being an outsider, of always being at odds with an establishment which is not the one I'd grown up with, which is very important, was very deeply anchored. And going to France, where people had different values again, and being there on the vacation, I spoke not bilingual but totally adequate, fluent, operational French by that time, merely rubbed it in. I mean, to take a totally trivial, familiar example, but one which was one of the first that hit me, so I shall claim a certain right of experience to mention it, was drinking soup. In France, you, of course, tip the plate away from you, and you move the spoon from you, away from you. In Britain, you normally do the opposite. I think I've got it right. No, it's the other way. It's the way around. Britain,
right.
Britain it's away, and France is towards you. You see, and I remember being baffled by this. And then it just seemed to me to be the way that the world was. In different places, different people did different things. And so nobody was necessarily right. I remember much later on I came across a phrase that Wittgenstein had. I've forgotten the exact German, so I'll say it in English. All could also be otherwise. I said, well, of course, it usually is too. So this, again, I suppose, laid the foundation, I'm guessing here, of two things. Firstly, an interest in China, where they certainly did do things very otherwise, it seemed, when I first got interested in it. And also for a view that normally if I picked up a secondary work on a subject that I knew something about, it was bound to be at least partly wrong. That was a working assumption. Indeed, later on in working in history, my normal procedure, when I knew a little tiny bit about something that I want to look at, was to look at sources first. Look at sources first, and then when you've got a working idea, try it out against a secondary work. Sometimes secondary work stood up, but not always. At any rate, the general assumption was that one would find always something new, because mostly adults were not known. My childhood were always talking good sense. Sounds very arrogant. It wasn't meant to be. It was the result of being bumped in various ways by circumstance in West Coast America, post-war Britain, and diplomatic France, because my father was an international civil servant, moving largely among diplomats and people of similar sort. So
that's excellent. Just a couple of more things on the dragon. One was that where you started playing chess seriously?
I don't know when I started playing chess seriously, but it must have been by the time I was 7, because quite early on, because my father, until he stopped being able to move behind the table, could always beat me even as an adult at ping pong. He was a very tough competitor indeed, and wily. I began to beat him regularly at chess when I was 7, and he refused thereafter to play with me. I played with my uncle, the one that was in Russia, into my mid-teens, but I still beat him fairly easily. Until late at night, his technique was a bit different from my father's. He'd keep me up till 3 or 4 in the morning until finally I either lost my concentration or, in the end, perhaps let him win a game. But he wasn't bad. I was better, but he wasn't bad. But my father, one of the few things I thought my father was a bit weak on, was when he just refused thereafter to play chess with me. So by 7 I must have been beginning to get somewhere. I don't know how. We had a chess team that was formed by a master called Denison Smith, who was...
Yes, Denny Whiff.
Denny Whiff, I don't like that name. I thought he was very good value. And that chess team did extremely well.
Won all the competitions.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was very proud to be on that team.
What about other things at the Dragon? Did you play any games or sing or act or anything?
I was bad. I would have loved to have acted. My friend Francis Hope was brilliant. I think the only boy there to carry off Hamlet under Bruno's guidance. And for me, that's still a normative Hamlet. But I had some minor part. I think I was Voltaire man, one of the ambassadors, about 2 lines. And that was typical. I get single 2 or 3 line parts. I would have loved to have been able to act. For some reason, I couldn't. I was not musical in the ordinary sense, but that's for very special reasons. My mother was too sensitive to music. I repeat, it wasn't she was not musical, she was too sensitive. She'd had Beethoven forced on her by her father, and she wanted nothing less than to be exposed close up to a Brandenburg or Beethoven. It got at her, it took her over, she hated it. So I picked this up by a kind of, almost one could say non-scientifically, but telepathy. And so I largely turned off music until I was probably about 12. When belatedly we discovered it, I have an extraordinarily Catholic taste in music, but there's absolutely nothing, virtually nothing to Dragon whatsoever, and a little bit to one master at St. Paul's. But basically to just trying on my own to regain the world of music. And my mother was very, very unhappy about her effect on me. She was well aware of it, but she would nobly in the early days come to concerts with me, but I could sense her effort, willpower. She sat there trying not to let it get at her. So in the end, when I was a little older, I went by myself. This had the effect of opening me, though, to music all at the same time. So whether I was listening to Guillaume de Machaut or Anton Webern, let alone on the classics, it was all music to me. And I took it as equal and on its own terms. And when I went to Cambridge, of course, I immediately joined the Cambridge Asian Music Circle under that neo-genius Lawrence Picken, a man who could play 70 instruments, virtually all of them non-British. And again, I took on music, particularly actually Indian classical music. It's simply just another music. I mean, I helped organise in a modest way the concert for Ravi Shankar and Chatterlal, the tabla player, that Lawrence put on in my first year at Cambridge. And, you know, this became another example of, in a sense, taking all cultures sort of on their own terms. I don't think all musics are equal by any means. But after having discovered, first I discovered Webern, with the R and the N, not just the R, Anton. And secondly, discovering Hindustani classical music. We're just part of this process and remain, you know, very deep inside me even now, though I don't listen to a great deal of music, except perhaps naughtily as a background to work when I'm feeling a bit depressed. It works marvellously. For that, nothing much stronger than Shostakovich. If I go stronger than that, I have to stop and listen to it properly. So I darn well should, but don't in every case. But again, it's another example of this curious destruction of the normal structure of growing up.
That's fascinating. Just finally on the Dragon, you were presumably ended up in class 1, top class.
Everything. Except the special calculus group taken by a former first wrangler, which I wasn't good enough for.
Well, who was that?
Wilhelm Meister. He was called Willy Meister, and that sounds as if I'm thinking of something else. But
Gerald Meister. His real name was.
Anyhow, he was an old man, very clever, and the sort of 4 or 5 kids who could, you know, do calculus went off and studied with him. However, I was strong in one thing, geometry. I won geometry prizes. You'd come from the bottom of A1 in maths to win prizes in deductive geometry, because I've got a very strong visual sense linked with chess, and I liked it. The other aspects of it I struggled, like I don't like to say. I always wanted to know math. I always was fascinated by maths. I was no, forgive the colloquialism, I was no bloody good at it. And so I remember trying to work out what one would do if one dropped the 5th postulate of Euclid. Parallel lines never meet, that's defines them. I remember trying to work out, must have been the age of 12, maybe just 13, trying to work out what that would mean, and being told by a very kind and very firm and completely correct maths master Wilkie that I should wait till later to look at that. But it symbolises my confusions, that I found maths fascinating but impossible, and I kept on trying to make a dent on it, but never got. I mean, I have calculus. I can do simple calculus and have been for ages, but I mean, it didn't come naturally.
But all the other subjects you were top of?
No, by no means. I was probably about in the area of 5th or 6th in classics. There are people like John Dunbabin and Luke Hodgkin around, and they were better than I was at classics. Francis Hope and I interchanged history and English. He tended to win more English tops. I tended to win more history, but we both were at some time at the top, one or the other in that. French, I really could, but after I left the Dragon, if I'd been doing French there at 14, I think I would have had no trouble sweeping the board. Francis was also very good at it. No, maths, I normally came bottom but 1 in the form of 16, unless they had geometry, where I'm quite capable of coming top for some totally weird reason. Later on in life, I found mathematical logic, this is a bedrock proto-maths, fascinating too, and it meant that when I tried to learn to write computer programs, I took a manual onto my boat in the Thames and spent a long weekend and came back and wrote programs that worked. It was Algol 68R. That was just an odd feature, that little bit of my brain could do maths, the rest wasn't up to it.
Did you win a scholarship or a...
Oh yes, I got a scholarship to St Paul's, but I actually came 16th on the roll at Eton, because I wanted to go to Eton because my best friend was going there, and did. But I missed it by one place. Actually, with all apologies to Eton, the best event in my life, because I ended up by getting superlative teaching in history and in French at St Paul's. And I also was able to go every weekend to the British Museum in London, which I did.
Tell me a little about St Paul's. What was good about it, apart from these teachers? Were there particular teachers?
The best teachers were extremely good.
Who were they?
There were a teacher called Snow, Frank Snow, who was sort of the junior of the top two teachers of history, and he wasn't bad. He challenged us to write a long essay through the first term, and I wrote mine on water in world history. And I certainly think the fact that I later on have worked a great deal on the history of water, particularly in China, must have owed something to what I learned by doing that. But the most important person was Philip Whitting. Whitting was a Byzantinist who was already an established figure in the field of Byzantine numismatics and coinage history, and on the board of several journals. He was an absolute professional. He was extremely good. I learned an enormous amount from him, and regarded him as essentially an oracle. But even so, one to be argued with, but with extraordinary respect. No, that was amazing, and it was probably because of his Byzantinism that at the age of 15 I read every volume, I'm not sure I quite finished, of Roger of Sicily, of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I read it mostly while travelling on the Underground, but going to games and other things, but also in gaps. I got through every volume, and that gave me a vision of history, which is very unusual to these days. It shouldn't be. But I can mentally, automatically, link the ancient world to the medieval world, down to the modern world, without any sense of shifting gears. As a continuous movement. I wrote my first important book, The Pattern of the Chinese Past, ultimately off a template, a time template, which was derived from reading Gibbon.
Very interesting.
It's very, very important, and that was Whitting's doing. He is acknowledged very handsomely in the book, and rightly so. So the other was the teacher of French, always known informally as Toby Parker. Not that we would ever have dreamt of calling him that to his face. Very, very interesting teacher who was, on the surface, a ferocious martinet. Your pen had to be in exactly the right place in front of you on the desk. I mean, exactly. Your eyes had to be on him as he talked, or you were in trouble. When I knew him much better, and he'd relaxed a great deal, I realised from what he said that he'd worked this out regretfully, because he'd begun life as a very soft master who was pushed around by the boys. So being a very bright and determined man, he'd worked out a bullying technique that was carefully relaxed as people became fit to be talked to as human beings, in his view. He was a brilliant language teacher, and he was also on Harrop's dictionary committee. In other words, in the French teacher and the history teacher, I had two of the most extraordinary people who were certainly at academic level of a university in their skills. And I mean that was extraordinarily important. But I got a scholarship to Cambridge when I was 16, and only just 16.
Gosh.
Because of the high pressure, fascinating teaching I got from these two people. Something had gone right. I was 2 years ahead of Francis Hope at Eton. I jumped 2 years. And I spent most of after I got the scholarship, I got it in December, wandering around Europe, mostly with my mother. She let me go my own.
So you left the school?
I left the school. There's no point in staying. So I went around. A lot of it I spent in Italy, and the rest in France.
What else happened at the school? I mean, were you doing anything else? Any hobbies or interests?
I played chess, and the great run of St Paul's chess began with the people who were running it when I moved in and joined them. But not me, but I was, as it were, the immediate successor, one of the immediate successors. St Paul's chess team, when I came, for the 3 and a bit years I was there, I lost 1 match. And that was very, very important, because at this point we wanted a chess tie for sporting respectability, and I was delegated by the club. I was then, I don't know, secretary or treasurer or something, but something not terribly important there, but deeply involved in the training programs of training our successors, which we took in incredible seriousness. That's why St Paul's became so very, very good. Your duty as a good chess player was to train the next generation, which we spent our lunch hours doing. I was delegated to see the High Master and make our request with some facts and figures. He disliked me because he knew I didn't believe in Christianity, but St Paul's, after all, does have a large Jewish population, and virtually all my best friends were Jewish. So there was a kind of bedrock. He couldn't get more than a certain distance. He didn't like me. He didn't approve of chess because it wasn't a physical body contact sport, or at least a physical sport. But I was very polite. He was at least tolerant, and I explained to him that we had racked up a record which no team in the history of the school, we'd done our homework, had managed to equal. Fencing had done very well, but even fencing were a bit behind us. And I requested very politely that we would have the right to wear, if we were members of the team, that's 6 people probably normally a year of the first team. He told me to go away and come back and see him in a week. When I came back, he said, "Well, Elvin, I've made up my mind. I'll tell you what you can do. You can have a chess club tie." The world exploded inside me, but I had to concentrate and listen to the conditions. On condition, he went on, that it is impossible to mistake it for a proper tie, sporting tie, and you will submit the design to me before I prove it finally. So I thanked him profusely and was told I could leave. Well, we got back and we designed a tie, black silk, thin silver diagonal stripes across it, which were the school colours, by the way, but not the ones used in the sporting ties, which are normally very garish. Took it back and he looked at it and said, "Yeah, well, I guess that will do." It was generally agreed we had the smartest tie in town, which we were pretty confident of. I don't know what they do now. They've had a very fine record, which I follow from the little newsletter from the school, but I don't know what their tie is, if they've got one now, whether it's the same or otherwise. But we won that one in a strange way. Perhaps I'll tell you why he disliked me. It was because I would always beat him in his special class on Christianity. He insisted I come. I asked to be excused and he insisted I come, and he got beaten up in argument there, which he disliked intensely. I tried to keep silent, but he would say, "Elvin, I see you don't agree with that." I said, "Well, that's true, sir, I don't. Will you explain why?" Then there would come a tsunami. And that wasn't good. When I went back to the school, he was the only master there who wouldn't speak to me.
Let's stop on that point. So, Mark, you won a scholarship at 16, you wandered around the continent, and then you went up to Cambridge. Which college did you go to?
Well, for yours and mine, to King's.
King's, the best. Why did you go to King's? I mean, it's just...
Because my grandfather went there.
Oh. He was an Elvin, was he?
Dutton.
Dutton.
He was the chap who became a Unitarian minister when he migrated to America.
Ah, right.
So it was simply a way of, if you like, making a choice without having to think too much about it, because the menu was, for someone at that age and with that lack of experience, far too big. It was like you wanted to take an a la carte menu and turn it into a table d'hôte, and it seemed the easiest way to do it. Actually, it proved very interesting. I actually had Isaiah Berlin on my interviewing panel, and I took my interview with a temperature of about 101.
Gosh.
Full of aspirin and what have you. And he asked me questions about Spinoza, and I hadn't actually read a word of Spinoza, and I'd read quite a number of books about him, so I think I just about got by on that second-hand knowledge, but feeling thoroughly ashamed of myself, but he seemed quite happy.
What did you read at Cambridge?
I read history, beginning with, obviously, medieval and modern European history, and finally I moved as a special subject to Chinese history. I was the only person to get a first essay got a start first in history with that particular special subject, was on the Boxer Uprising.
Oh.
So that was what opened that particular door.
Who were your teachers?
The only person I regard as really memorable, some were quite good, some were, I won't say awful, but below the standard one would have expected, was Mary Chibnall, who was quite special.
Marjorie? Or Mary?
Marjorie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Marjorie Chibnall. And I only did a term with her, but I suddenly had this... Sorry, thank you for correcting me. It's probably 30 or 40 years since I last thought about that. But it was instantly recognisable as real scholarship. And so I retained an extraordinary, pity I didn't study with her more, a great affection for her. Walter Ullmann wasn't bad too. It was very useful to have him as a guide to reading medieval Latin, which actually I put to use again recently.
Yes. And in King's you must have had Christopher Morris.
Christopher Morris was a family friend, but let's just leave it at that.
And John Saltmarsh?
Similar comments. I'm sorry, these are people who are characters, but they were not in any sense kind of historian I'd expected. Marjorie Chibnall certainly was.
Was Eric Hobsbawm there then or not?
No.
No.
At least I didn't meet him, which is strange if he was there.
Poston, was he there?
Poston was at Cambridge, and I listened to one of his series of lectures, which was pretty good. I mean, I learned later to get a very great respect for him indeed, but the lecturing style was quite hard to follow, a bit explosive, and but no, I mean, I learned in due course that he was a giant, but it wasn't immediately obvious from the lectures, which were obviously very learned. But I think the only other person who I went to who really stuck in my mind, and now my memory not having been primed, was somebody who began very well and very modestly and then got a little bit above himself, who talked largely upon Paddington and Oceania. You'll remember who it was.
Oceania?
The book.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And Harrington.
Yes, yes.
Very, very well-known name, which has just temporarily slipped my mind. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
So, no, I got far more out of going to lectures on non-historical subjects. In fact, that was the great thing about Cambridge. I could go off to John Wisdom's lectures on, as a sort of semi-Wittgensteinian approach to philosophy. I could go to lectures on anthropology, and I could go to all sorts of other things. So, in fact, as far as lectures were concerned, I hardly went to a single history lecture at all, practically, at some points.
This was about 1957, 58, something like that?
I got my degree in 59.
56, yeah.
56 it began. So I mean, Cambridge was an enormous intellectual stimulus. By going to lectures, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's broadly true, which were not directly part of my subject. I mean, I've always regarded these other subjects as being an integral part of the analysis of the human experience, which is what history is meant to be about across time.
Yeah.
And therefore, I mean, I suppose, although the anthropologist I probably learnt most from in the end was Bill Skinner in the Chinese Field, people like Maya Fortius, I mean, wonderful people to talk to. And
you meet Edmund Leach?
Yes, though I didn't know him. I mean, Maya I got on very well with, possibly because he was a friend of my father's. But
Jack Goody?
Oh, Jack Goody, of course, yes. I mean, Jack Goody's wife at that time, Esther, was, of course, an old school friend of my wife.
Was she?
So,
in America?
Well, that actually came into the picture more after I graduated, but to be accurate about time. But, there was and there were people like Moses Findlay who were fascinating on slavery and classical history and so on. So, but that wasn't part of the syllabus. It was wandering outside the bounds. I mean, I could do a pretty good job myself in a few days, even then, on getting together a basic bibliography for myself on the mainline things, because there was plenty of starting points. But new starting points, new perspectives, Cambridge was absolutely priceless that way. And I should have to stop and think, but I went to a great number of things.
You had an interest in science. Did you attend any science lectures or anything?
No, I did talk to a lot of people in the sciences, but At that point I hadn't got too deep into it, but it was completely obvious to me, you may disagree, that if you're going to try to get a mental, please do if you like, and then challenge me, if you're going to get a grip on what ultimately at the very bottom distinguishes what we loosely and rashly call the modern era, because of course some of it was around in Archimedes' time, it is fundamentally something to do with the nature of whatever modern science is in terms of modernity. And I found that trying to get a grasp of this was something which I gradually got more and more interested in. It's evasive, but it's not unreal. It's more of a snark than a boojum perhaps, but it's very evasive. And so I was always very careful, because of my limited knowledge of science at that point, still is very limited, to explore but not to come to conclusions. But I was interested. I knew Gert Birkdahl, for example. I was actually given his book in draft on Newton to read to see if his explanation of Newton's Principia was accessible to a layman. The answer is partially, and I know he was very disappointed. It was a very well done book, I think, but it was difficult. So I was always aware of this, and also very conscious of the need to take this particular one very slowly, because it was extreme importance and also precarious for me.
You said you did Chinese as a special subject. Who did you do that with?
I did it with a strange man called Victor Purcell, with whom I actually argued a good deal, because at this point I began to argue. I'd spent my almost entire summer vacation at British Museum Newspaper Library, which was then probably still as Hendon, and I had read every page of the relevant period covered, which is the Boxer Uprising, its, as it were, its build-up and its aftermath, in the North China Herald, which was probably the best single source to read. And I knew that I was the first person to have read it there, because I cut all the pages. And true enough, it turned out that he had not read it. So we had a set to, I would quote the North China Herald back at him. We settled down to an amiable, after a big flame-up in which I stood up for myself.
Yes.
He was a bully, so I just hit straight back. And so at that point we had an amiable draw and got on quite well afterwards. But I was shocked that he hadn't read a very important primary source, which I had read. But that was very interesting.
Were there other sinologists? Was Joseph Needham there then?
I wasn't a sinologist at that point. I was a historian. No, the sinology came in for purely pragmatic reasons. I mean, I always approached history, at least from that time on, as essentially involving the framing of a question. And I went around looking for questions that seemed to be interesting. My first paper in public at the Old King's Political Society,
which was held in my room, which you'll come to.
Yes, I know. Was on Cathars and troubadours, on the mouse in China.
Did you know Arthur Hibbert then?
I knew Arthur Hibbert. I liked him personally. I liked him, but he wasn't any help with that particular subject. But I know he's a very nice man. And I said, why should you get troubadour poetry, as in the Hillenbergen anthology, for example, at the same time as you get the Albigenses, the Cathari, in apparently much the same society? What on earth could they have had in common? I don't think I came up with the right answer, but I think I posed the question quite effectively. And I read some of the sources. I read the Chronicle of Pierre de Cernay, for example, in Latin, and was amused by the way as you went through it. Every now and then there'd be a little italics put in by that it says miraculum and so on. And I read Hillenbergen to the best of my ability. I mean, I had good French and I spoke rough Italian, so that was
slowly
not impossible. But all the same, it was a typical operation. I took on something that was in a way beyond me, but because the question was interesting, I think did set thoughts moving. China came simply because of three very obvious questions, which ultimately derive quite directly, and at least two of them do, avowedly from Max Weber, and the third probably does too, really, as well. Given, and here Weber was not up to speed, but that's a different issue, that China, particularly after the early publication of Needham's work, was clearly at some point technically ahead of the West. I take the height of the Middle Ages, take 1100 perhaps as a reference date. why did China not have something like an industrial revolution? Why didn't it have a scientific revolution? And whatever happened to democracy? The last being an add-on, really. Later on, I rephrased that, but that was the primitive form in which it came. And I took up Chinese immediately after I'd done my final examinations, in order to begin to equip myself to look at what seemed, after Weber had set the way. He underestimated China seriously, because he didn't want to read Jesuit works. If he'd read Jesuit works seriously, and I have read in Heidelberg University Library the very copies of the memoirs concerning the Chinese, which Weber would have had to hand if he'd wanted them. Why did China quite clearly not succeed in carrying on from its medieval preeminence, as we now were getting to see from Needham, in certain very relevant areas? So that was the continuation of this habit of asking questions, and why I sat down to get the tools of the trade, which took me far longer than I had imagined. I mean, I rampage quite easily through European languages if I really get settled down with a dictionary. Chinese is a different proposition. Got very badly stuck for a while.
How long?
A year and a half before I was beginning to produce anything I could put a footnotes to. And even then, after that, it remained still a long, hard slog. At that point, I was actually moving, but I went to Harvard and took courses that Fairbank had there for 2 years and learned academic Japanese and special course. After that, particularly about pillaging Japanese work as an intermediate halfway house, because they're very, very good, I was able to at least get some movement. But Cambridge was above all interesting for opening the mind. Technically, I don't think in my area of history, you must speak for others that you know better than I do, a bit disappointing. With, I said, singular exception of Chibnall. Somebody who knows what she's doing. Right. Oh. And it was not disappointing in terms of opening the horizons to all sorts of other subjects. When
you said that it was Chianye, it wasn't Peter Laslett, was it?
No, it wasn't. He's gone to America. Yeah. This chap, and he had a lovely habit. I remembered. Now, Peter, I did know later. Got on quite well with. He had a lovely habit of saying, "I would invite you to agree with me," that, which I found charmingly modest, and then produced a very powerful point. So I thought this was a lovely combination. He's very well known as he got American egotism after going there for a while, and so while still remaining a very remarkable...
Wasn't Pocock or...
Pocock, yeah, it was Pocock.
David, J.G.A. Pocock.
Do you recognise my description? But I mean, but he began brilliantly. Yeah. And humanly and charmingly. And the quality was very high. Yeah. So the Oriental Institute was a different game again altogether. I went there. I studied for a year at my own expense. I didn't get a state scholarship. I lived off £250 for a year.
Why didn't... I mean, you got to start first.
I got to start first and I didn't get a state scholarship.
That's strange.
Well, I lived on £250. My father paid my book bills.
And you were still at King's?
I was still accepted. I could still dine in King's and use its facilities. But for that year I worked round the clock. And I lived in a room which was cheap because it was exposed to garage fumes in Victoria Street. And at the end of it I got a state studentship, and the year after that I got an extremely well-paid fellowship to Harvard. So it was quite an interesting up and down ride. But the quality of teaching at the Oriental Institute was extremely good. There were two quite remarkable people there, in fact more than that really, but the people three really, I dealt with were all master sonologists. And it was not easy. They didn't believe in letting you take crampons up the north face of the Eiger or anything, or slings you just to go up your fingernails. But you got to the top fast, and there was a heck of a view at the top. So that is Ted Pulley-Blank, still alive, or was when I last was in Canada, Dennis Twitchett, and Pete van der Loon, that's gone now, who later on became professor at Oxford. I mean, this was suddenly going and moving. I mean, they had very limited visions historically, I think. Very restricted, but as the art of extracting fairly accurate information from extremely difficult texts, which is what sonology is about. They could hardly have been bettered anywhere in Europe at that time, taken together.
Mm.
So I was, again, extremely lucky.
What was it like going back to America?
Well, it was a different world. I'd been back intermittently when my grandparents were alive. But one was conscious of living on the edge of something dangerous all the time. Occasional encounters with the police, just an accident, left one with a very uncomfortable feeling. And of course my introduction to America when I came back that time was to corruption. I came by boat, one of the last generation to go there by boat. So I love the transatlantic voyage. Arrive in New York, and there is
about 62.
62.
Yeah.
And I am met by a very courteous member of the Commonwealth Foundation. But my luggage has to go through customs, and the customs man opens my main bag and sees a pamphlet issued in English by Mao Zedong. I'm going to Harvard to study Chinese, among other things, politics. He said that is subversive or something similar, and you're not allowed to take that. And at this point, I didn't know what to say. I explained it. It was because I was working on this subject at Harvard, and I could demonstrate all this. And then I turned around to see where the Commonwealth representative had gone. He'd vanished. I thought, well, that is fun. Well, I hope this doesn't end up at Ellis Island, but it's looking unpleasantly entertaining. Well, I kept the conversation going, and he didn't seem interested. And then the customs man was summoned somewhere, somehow, and I was standing there with my open bag, wondering what the dash expletive was going on. A bit later, a man with a caricature face of a baby boxer, beaten up. I learned later he was called Jampol, appeared with the customs officer from behind a pillar. And the customs man said, "Educational material?" I said, "Sure is." Slammed it shut, put chalk on it. "That's right," he said. And as I was taken away by the customs by the now miraculously rematerialized representative of the Commonwealth Foundation, he said, "You just cost us $50. Jampol was a fixer employed by important employers and their associates to deal with, if you like, routine problems of misunderstanding with the customs, and they knew the tariffs. That was, I was teased for about 6 months at receptions by the foundation about this. People got bored of that and moved on to somebody else. It wasn't actually a prelude of things to come at that point, but it was quite a shock. I mean, Harvard was further professional training, extremely important. Again, the mental horizons of Harvard sonology at that time, the techniques were very good. The library fantastic. Were again also extremely narrow. And again, I was aware that at the end of the day, I was far more with sociologists like Bill Skinner, Skinner claims to be an anthropologist, but at any rate.
Yeah.
But later on, of course, Maurice Friedman and many others whom I got to know quite soon. Maurice, of course, back it was in LSE at that time, I think. Were much more my style of finding the questions I wanted to answer. And that was a source of discomfort. I remember once, a bit later, when I was a minor established beginner in the professional field, went to a conference in New Hampshire, Wentworth by sea, where, if you like, Bill Skinner had tried to have a multidisciplinary approach, and one of the people there was Arthur Wright, a heavyweight God professor from Yale, overrated, unlike his wife was underrated, was brilliant, and died young. And he sort of thought, as a historian, I would be an ally against the dread anthropologists and sociologists. And I remember he actually came walking out of a session with me and said, "Well, Mark, the historians won that one, didn't they?" Goodness, what do I say? I don't want to have bad relations, but I don't believe a word of this. So I said, well, I thought we made some contact, or something boring like that. I fudged it. But I remember being actually genuinely shocked. However, that's jumping ahead in time.
How long were you in Harvard?
For 2 years. I could have stayed to do a PhD there. They offered it to me, and it would have been a compliment. It was a compliment. But I was aware of the time consumption, the money consumption of doing general exams in America. Whereas back in Cambridge, I just had to write a thesis.
Yeah.
I'd also been offered a job at Cambridge at that point as an assistant lecturer, and very generous terms to let me have enough time to finish my thesis, which I'd already begun. It was on the first democratic institution in China that actually functioned, run by Chinese. A book that in the end, because of Fairbanks' hostility, was postponed from publication, and then in the end never published, though I pillaged it for articles. Never published as a whole.
Right. So you didn't publish it, but you were writing it there, or you came back?
I began writing it there, but what's interesting is the again, the role of chance. This is genuinely unexpected. I had a great row in private, one-on-one with Fairbank, about how I was rewriting my thesis for publication. He was too important to have a violent disagreement with, so I just dug my heels in and blocked. But we left in a very unfriendly mood. He didn't like even polite blocking. I wasn't established enough to risk tangling with the overwhelming dominant figure and patronage in the field. I might want a job in America. A reference from Fairbank. We're down nearly at that period, decisive in getting something at any rate. And I didn't know if I was going to move or not. But I couldn't write it his way because it was wrong. I'm sorry, it was wrong. And so I needed to do something else. I got a contract from Weidenfeld and Nicholson to write a short history of modern China. Well, I soon realized as I sat down to fill up my time while I recovered psychologically doing this, that I needed to go back to what I later called, and people have usually adopted this term, the medieval economic revolution in China. Think of Marco Polo as symbolizing that time and event. So I wrote the book backward, having written most of the part on, not all, the more recent period. I then wrote the medieval period, and then I had a sense of how I was going to write the first part, which is roughly when the empire crystallized. And I wrote that book with a very gentle thanks to John Fairbank for his generosity in letting me pursue another project while I was there. And to my amazement, it became an almost overnight success. It was called The Pattern of the Chinese Past.
Sure.
And it simply ran through all the questions that I'd been raising in my last year as an undergraduate, with myself primarily, and explained at least a small part, but a useful part, of the problem that China ran into, which was having a very productive late or high medieval technology in farming, which did not advance technically much further, but spread around a very large part of the cultivable area, and then by supporting a much increased population meant that there was a kind of ceiling. There was no easy further progress, and a population growing and opportunities for things like, say, new large effective water systems increasingly disappearing, and the marginal return on effort clearly reaching in many cases a ceiling. This was the infamous high-level equilibrium trap, but at any rate I'd established a number of things. Why China stayed together over the long run, the increasing medieval rate of improvement of technology in the centre core, which enabled them to finance and equip ultimately armed forces and administration strong enough to keep the place together just. And quite a number of other questions, including beginning on the science one, but I still hadn't got very far there. And so that was the result of that book, which in effect made my name, such as it was the result of a quarrel with John Fairbank and a disagreement which left me having to go sideways to continue at all under the circumstances.
Can I ask you something about that and have a glass of water if you...
Yeah, please.
I mean, the folk myth is that the famous phrase, the high-level equilibrium trap, was devised over a cup of coffee in Glasgow with another person.
Oh, yes, this is a very important story. It was something which got its name there and much of its substance, but I was aware of I studied the technology and come to the technological conclusion long before. Formulating it into a coherent form and generalizing it was very much the work, and it's not folk tale. I told it myself and tell it repeatedly with my very old friend Radharaman Sina, who was a lecturer in agricultural technology at Glasgow, where I'd moved after my assistant lectureship ran out.
Yeah.
And that saddened me because my name has been largely linked with that. It should be always either Sina and Elvin or Elvin and Sina. I have no preference. But the famous graph, which of course ultimately borrowed from Ricardo, as Rado would be the first to admit, but was found to fit by him, not by me. What I contributed was a fairly detailed amount of research on how that technology reached a ceiling. He put it into a neat, memorable, marketable form, and also, I think, from the economist's point of view, into one that could be formalized. It was very important. And I have tried, every time I've talked about that, I hate talking about it now, it's boring, but it stood up incredibly, and I always try to stress that it was Elvin and Sina, or Sina and Elvin, whichever way you like, and he has not received, if there's credit due, anything remotely like the credit he needs for it. And I don't know, again, why that happened, but
well, you wrote the book.
I wrote the book, and I gave a paper on it quite a long time before that.
Yeah.
But in 1969.
So if China hit this high-level equilibrium trap, why did Europe not hit it?
Well, it's partly the result of the structure of farming. I mean, this is fundamentally most evident in the most productive farming, productive per acre, at least, which is wet field rice farming. So you have to break it up a certain amount. But what happened, and this is a grotesque oversimplification, but it captures something critical, that the Sung, southern Sung, and later dynasties of Chinese, well, the Ming, and of course the Qing was Sino Manchu, of basically a Chinese caste or character, taxed farming on the acreage of cultivable land. And there was some grading, but rather rough and ready by the general fertility, and it tended not to be revised very often, in fact hardly at all. And so what do you do if you have got, say, a hectare, or shift measurements, or an acre of land? You try to produce as much out of it as you possibly can, because you pay your tax at the same level once and for all each year. If you can get a second crop out of it, if you can grow an intercrop, if you can even do more than that and have a few things growing, particularly in the winter, which you can harvest, all of that is just pure gain. So the Chinese concentrated brilliantly on heavy fertilizing, so that fallow soon disappeared completely. And by the southern Sung, people are already commenting on a place if it's still got fallowing, at least in the south and centre. You develop all forms of intercropping you can, all forms of rotation you can, anything to keep the fertility of that priceless little piece of land going. Because if you open new land, you have usually I think a 3-year either no tax or low tax grace period, after which you pay tax on it. And so as far as people could, they put productivity per acre up, and they put productivity in the end per hour of human work down. And it is that scissor effect which is characteristic of China, and it grows to some extent out of the fiscal system. It's much easier to collect taxes that way, and to some extent out of the fact that a system where irrigation can be refined and refined is capable with fertilizer of going way up the per acre productivity, even as the per hour productivity tends to drift off. I don't think in general, both irrigated and fertilized farming in Europe, that anything like as acute as that developed. The dependence on water was extremely important. Most of the China plain and large lesser patches of central China are essentially former marshes, which filled up and have been drained. And so the amount of land that was already proto-leveled, or partly leveled already, was very great, and also very fertile, or potentially fertile. But China then got into, among other things, a very severe fertilizer shortage. And it ultimately needed Justus von Liebig, not Chinese, to find the way out of that particular trap.
Before that they were using soy.
They used everything in their hands, and they had the kids out in the winter on the roads to get leaves, and they picked up dung off pigs and cattle and everything. The number of cattle fell because it was only in certain upland areas that anything like a large number of cattle were workable economically. So you have an upland regime which is a bit different. So the large animals tend to drop. Scavengers like pigs and poultry go up. And you keep on pressing. And the extreme ingenuity, but the returns for the effort put in go down and down.
Seems that it's almost exactly the same decade that Geertz's Agricultural Involution book comes out, and there is some similarity between the two ideas.
I'd heard of Geertz, but I'd never read him till afterwards. But the Chinese practice of this, of course, goes really back to around, take the year 1000. It's a very good rough measure of when it begins to become an important development, and it spreads. And one of the things that the Chinese bureaucracy did achieve, a great economic value, it's often downgraded, and it certainly had bad aspects, was that officials had to move around the country. They went to a place that was, in their view, backward. They would introduce and get credit for introducing more intensive, labour-intensive techniques of farming. So you got, in the end, an agricultural base which was subject to very different rules and had enormously reduced possibilities. I mean, when fertilizer was always used to some extent, I think, in English farming, you know more about this than I do, until, the 18th century, but it was there, but it wasn't everywhere. In China it was everywhere, and repeated. And they became masters of such techniques as halfway through the crop putting on fertilizer. Delicate business, you can get it wrong, but you don't just begin by fertilizing the soil, you actually put a second layer on. And they even imported fertilizer materials, mostly soybean cake, from Manchuria by sea, down to what's now Shanghai, to try to make up this deficit. It was an economy that, in the end, though amazing in its own way, was under tremendous pressure. I mean, there's a great deal more to say, but that was a huge stumbling block. It's still there, actually.
That, I mean, we're jumping ahead a great way, and perhaps we'll do it. I mean, you had shown a kind of barrier and block, and something that was extremely difficult to get beyond. As you know, in about 2000 or a little before, a number of Californian historians, of whom Pomerantz is perhaps the best known, argued that in fact there was no block, that the West and the East were roughly at the same level till 1800, and then the great divergence took place.
Well, there are two comments on this. Firstly, it isn't true. As far as farming is concerned, there are many areas where China was actually ahead for a while. And, I mean, the use of iron metallurgy from the Han onwards, from cast iron tools, is amazing. It was far ahead of the West. But the real point is that they don't read the best studies, and they don't get involved, as I did, in the reality of wet agriculture particularly, but Chinese-style farming. I've walked around fields. I was interested above all initially in water control systems. There are certainly interesting water control systems in Europe, studied briefly by Brodel among others, but nothing like the gigantic systems or the enormous reliance I think you find in China in percentage terms. And they don't study the difference in the problems of keeping the soil going. I mean, fallowing alone gives the game away. No, they're quite wrong, I'm afraid. But what's more, they're wrong for a very interesting reason. They stopped reading German. I discovered, admittedly, after coming to these conclusions broadly myself, that there was a massive authority in the form of Wilhelm Wagner, whose book in 1926, based on over a decade of teaching farming to Chinese in China before the First World War, and household budget surveys, as well as a very well-trained chemical knowledge of what's involved in farming as of that period, that he'd more or less said it already in a book of about 600 pages, which I've now read, but I hadn't at that point. Nobody reads it, and yet it's still completely relevant. You cannot read that book and believe anything about the comparability of farming in the two areas. As a general rule, of course, there are always small pockets where this kind of thing can be supported. I don't think they've done their homework. Americans don't live on the land anymore. They did once, but they have lost a feeling for what it's like. They don't. It's imaginary. Also, I studied technology a great deal. I wrote about it. I reconstructed the first multi-spindle water-powered spinning machine, which was already in a book in China in 1314, the Agricultural Encyclopedia Nongshu of Wang Jun. And that was actually passed as workable, though rickety, by Dundee firm of spinning engineers, who sent me a charming letter, I've still got it, suggesting numerous improvements in your medieval machine. But they agreed it was workable, and it had multiple rotating, in effect, equivalents functionally of flyers to give the twist, and a pulling device which pulled it out. And it was primarily for long fibres, like, for example, hemp or flax. It would not have worked well for short fibre cotton, but it was, if you like, arkwright many hundreds of years before the event. What's interesting is there were links, of course, between Italy in silk handling, Italy and China. God knows how they got there. Well, there are many differences in the technology. There's something also surprisingly similar. And I don't know if anything came across either way, but at any rate, I reconstructed these things, and I don't think Ken, who is full of energy and ideas, has really got the basic knowledge to talk about what Chinese farming was like. And I certainly know that Japanese historians, with whom in particular I had contact, and from whose work I drew, people like Amano Motonosuke, though he didn't read my stuff, but I mean people who studied him and did, feel that the picture that was painted in that book was, and later works too, was broadly realistic. Now, if you accept that this agricultural problem, and you can get the essence of it from Wagner, is correct, then the two systems are not fundamentally comparable. Where trouble comes is that, conceptually, if you don't think about it clearly, is that there are a number of Chinese genuine creations, far less than many people think, but they exist, which do match up even as late as the late 16th century with the best that Europe could produce. The most interesting, and one I've written on and done the maths for, going on from Needham and Robinson's work, is the system of equal temper tuning, which requires good maths. You need to know not just the 12th roots of 2, but the 24th roots of 2 for the diameters of wind instruments. Experiments, constructed boards for tuning, which were made for this purpose, and essentially results that in all but the most refined terms stand up today as well as they did then. And they're pre-Stephen, they're pre-Europe. Only by about a generation. Done in the 1570s, they were published in 1595, and Stephen wasn't even published, so that on certain printing results, the Chinese win. By Zhu Ziyu. I've written about this at great length, with the maths. There are these cases that show that you can pick these few, they're rare, peaks out of Chinese world invention, and say until about that point at least they could still match here and there. But the system in Europe was by that point developing into something which is far more formidable than individuals. It was developing into an entire interacting system, which is the crux. China did not develop, outside some very limited fields, an interacting system which communicated, criticized, commented, financed, and passed down the generations. There are occasional peaks where you can be misled into thinking that China really had enough to have had modern science. There is this problem. The problem for Chinese science is that I think you could say that culturally most of the resources were there. I studied the history of probabilistic thinking in China, wondering why, for the gambling mad country, nothing like the work of Cardano or Fermat and Pascal or their successors, Huygens and so forth, had apparently developed. And I was able to show that all the mathematical tools, including Pascal's triangle, which is of course not Pascal's at all but very ancient, the concepts of permutations and combinations were all present and used, well, probably by the end of the Song, but certainly they were around a bit later, all there, and yet they were never put together in such a coherent fashion that you have the basic system of Western probability. By basic I mean before Bayes made everything a bit more difficult, but basic probability for coins, cards, both used, they played with them, and all sorts of similar things. All the tools were there, and they got about halfway, and then, for reasons that are completely opaque to me, it just never got any further. But the first time you get a proper analysis of the relative probabilities of a simple gambling game and the correctly correlated payoffs is sometime in the 19th century, which is tantalizing beyond belief, because I can't see how we can rule out some European influence by this point. But it did happen. It wasn't quite complete, but it got most of the techniques of adding and combining multiplying probabilities appropriately, not quite perfectly, but what you've got at any rate is a demonstration of a latent cultural capacity, or semi-latent, that was never properly realized except in a few odd cases. It is ultimately tantalizing. China did not have modern science, that is balderdash. On the other hand, people who write it off, like Toby Huff, a very interesting man, also completely missing the point. It is a knife-edge case, which is perpetually tantalizing one by partial or occasionally, as with equal temperament tuning, isolated complete successes. But it never turned into a coherent system of socio-intellectual interaction, and there's a vast gulf there. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I like Ken, he's a good-hearted chap, he stirred up a lot of interest, but I simply do not buy the fundamentals, and I have looked at things in detail. The techniques of wet field farming, and also certain aspects of technology, things like the spinning, which died out, I forgot to mention. That water-powered multi-spindle spinning died out in China. By the Ming period, the end of the Ming, it was merely a memory in increasingly badly executed woodcuts and garbled texts that have been very difficult to reconstruct, but can be.
As did this great Susong clock.
Oh, the clock, which is of course a water wheel, which goes round in big ticks as a bucket, fills up and then tips.
That died out too. I mean, that was just.
Well, that was brilliant, but it is not. It is not, if you like, a reiterating or recycling mechanism in quite the same way as, say, a Virgin Folio clock is. Again, why it shouldn't have led that way, I don't know. Virgin Folio is as simple a mechanism intrinsically, in fact it's more simple in many ways, than the elaborate escapement that Needham and de Solar Price reconstructed very accurately. And I mean, they knew that the temperature should be kept constant, the water gets more viscous and doesn't flow so fast. And they had to have the right level in the tanks for the equal pressure. They got all that. They got a long way and then it stopped. So China is perpetually teasing one. That's a very good example of clockwork. It gets so close and it doesn't build up any momentum. In the case of clockwork for astronomy, it's something of an imperial monopoly, not completely. And therefore there are problems perhaps in it spreading widely or interesting people. But there is a very big difference. The first time that Western history really starts to move away from Chinese history is ultimately in developing the system out of which modern science developed. And I've also studied this. I mean, I've studied, as you know, in more recent years, history of plant science relating to one topic which interests me. The proper demonstration and analysis at the first level, of course still going on, of the reality over a very wide range of flowering plants, not everyone, of a basic sexual method of reproduction. Of course there are others like layering and forms of propagation and grafting. Now that is a wonderfully interesting case of where ultimately, I suppose you can say, apart from the stimulus from the beginnings of the modern scientific revolution in other fields, not without its influence, is an age-old subject that had got going again in the Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, through commentaries and corrections, and then steady extensions and refinements and systematizations and improved observations. It crosses a frontier quite late in the 17th century where serious, properly constructed experimental proof is used, and you are suddenly in a different world. And yet each step is so slight, unless you've followed it through, almost like grandmother's footsteps. It's hard to know how it happened. I think I've done this. That was interlinked with a constant intercourse and criticism and debate. And you just do not find this kind of intensity, even in the greatest of the late traditional Chinese botanist pharmacologist like Li Shijun, an enormous 1695 work. I mean, it still doesn't look too bad against things like Fuchs's Herbal, either Latin or German, which are very impressive. It's still in runner's terms, he's still up with the pack, even perhaps at the back of the pack, up with the pack. The time you get to the middle of the 17th, above all the later 17th century, the gaps opened and then systematic experiment begins to come in. And you've crossed a line. And it went on.
I'm going to now move on.
It's simply different. I've studied both in detail.
Yep. Well, we've got 10 minutes and we've got the rest of your life and your family and everything. You came back to England, then you went to Glasgow. For how long?
Just 5 and a bit years.
So we'll skim over Glasgow, because you then, when did you go to Australia? Was it after?
Well, I came to Oxford for 17 years.
Oxford for 17 years. Oh, well, we better mention that.
Well, actually, oddly enough, at Oxford, I had a very profitable time in many ways. I was a single father, because my first wife, with whom I'm still on good terms, she's a very fine poet, Anne Stevenson. Indeed, she even wrote me an email a few days ago, asking me why Chinese Buddhas smile. That's for another occasion. But I was left with 2 sons. I did just enough research to keep me as a way, myself in play, and otherwise I worked mostly at teaching and administering and bringing them up. So apart from doing a historical atlas of China, which was a lot of work, very interesting, and which turned me again towards the history of the environment, which had always interested me, way back, ever since my grandmother, whom I mentioned, gave me a copy of Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, her first important popular book. And also being brought up for a time in a shared household with the younger sister of the other family, but the younger sister of Eve Balfour, of course, is famous in this world as an ecologist, environmentalist. And I learned to make compost heaps when I was 9 or 10. So at Forest Hill, outside Oxford. But the atlas moved me back towards saying that there's a missing dimension to my economic history, and that is the environment. And this again is something that Ken has worked on it rightly. I don't think he's come to terms with the extent to which China was an overworked and exhausted countryside, except for a few peripheral areas like Manchuria. Long before the crisis caused by the West had really begun to bite. And indeed the West rescued China, above all with people like Justus von Liebig and chemical fertilizers. I'm sorry to say it that way. I'm going back to a common sense traditional view here, but I do know an awful lot of details, and I would support this very seriously.
So Oxford was sort of holding the fort, so to speak.
It did.
And then you...
Well, I worked on a few other things. I got very interested in women's history and published quite a bit on that, particularly on the cult of virtuous widows who didn't remarry. And so I did a number of things in this area, originally because of a desire to study population. And it turned out that the best sources for population were these enormously detailed, extensive, not enormously detailed, substantially detailed in the best cases, and very numerous mini biographies of virtuous, chaste widows, from which I was able to get, with a research assistant, Josephine Fox, who worked most of the time with me, usable, though limited, data on perinatal infant mortality. All of the other people, all the Californians included, do not have, for the main part of China, the way of checking up on very early deaths. If you take a census once a year, you're going to miss an enormous number of deaths in that kind of demographically primitive world, of kids who've died in a month or two, and they're numerous. I've recently come across and worked, and I've got in, I hope, publication process, a paper made actually in the early 1930s where monthly checks were taken in the same area that we concentrated on, the lower Yangtze, and the models for circa 1814, our old one, and this fit like that. So much so I wondered if I'd been cheating. And so, I mean, all of the demography here, this is not true for the imperial family or for Manchu Bannerman, but most of the demography done by the California school is out of date and useless. Sorry, you can repeat that. They're nice kids. And it's because of a very difficult factor. Where do you control a massive, very much perinatal, it's above all the first few months, infant mortality? You can't, it isn't captured. But the widows, when they were widowed, it was recorded how many kids, at what age, and often the kids' ages, they had alive when they were widowed. And when you've got 20,000 cases we have, you can make something of that. It's very rough, but it indicates it's big. And so we come back to a situation where the California school has tried to be too kind to China for very good motives. But I don't think the data, their data, and mine's publicly, ours are publicly available on the internet. Very hard to handle. I had to develop special computer programs to handle it. Not complicated mathematically, but complicated conceptually. And it's all spelled out and examples are given. You come up with something which happens we didn't know this in advance, happens to match the one really detailed micro-survey made in the early 30s. With monthly visits to every household. So it was micro, but it's so close, I just thought, I don't believe this. So, I mean, I don't buy the California school. I am half Californian. My mother was Californian, and I'd love to say I'm part of the Californian school, but I'm not.
Mark, on that nice note, we've just got 4 minutes.
Okay,
I want to mention two things. One is you married again,
Yep.
Diane. Can you tell me something very briefly about Diane? She's a potter by...
Diane was trained at the Central School of Art in London, now linked with St Martin's, in both theatre design and historical costume.
Hmm.
She practiced for a while in rep theatre. It's a tough trade, until this was disrupted by the young man she was going to marry, more or less dumping her at the altar, not quite, but very nearly like that. And then she remarried. She didn't remarry, I'm sorry, she re-engaged. She would say herself a bit too soon, possibly. But at any rate, had two very nice children born who she then had to bring up herself because that marriage broke up.
Hmm.
When we met, we were two single parents who both brought up two kids into their mid-teens. We knew exactly what the other was up against. And slowly and a little awkwardly, perhaps at first, we cemented an increasingly serious relationship. It's also the link, bizarrely, was my first wife, because my first wife, Anne Stevenson, was very good friends with Diane's parents. Dr. William Montgomery is a very distinguished Scottish poet and folklorist, and his wife Nora, who is a distinguished folklorist, and also did a lot of work for women's magazines in the 30s as a designer, very gifted visually. And so the Montgomerys, on Anne's recommendation, looked me up when they came to Oxford, and there was Diane. Well, it moved from that point onwards, and Diane has been a fantastic complement, because she's an eye person, not a word person, though she can be extremely precise and deadly when she wants to. She's too polite sometimes to say what she thinks openly. And it's certainly when working with things like plants, which I'm still very much a beginner, it's wonderful to have somebody who can identify an awful lot of things and find them very quickly right next door. So there was many links there. And
I'm going to interrupt
yes.
that for the last, which is just a 2-minute plug for your children's books.
Okay.
You've written a trilogy,
Yeah.
which is called The Dream God trilogy,
yes.
under another name.
Well, it is and it isn't. My full legal name, and it was at birth, is John Mark Dutton Elvin. The Dutton is my mother's maiden name, and John was my first name until I went, in fact, to the Dragon, where I had something like 7 other Johns in a class. And I asked my father if please I could change my working first name to my legal second name. And very reluctantly he said, yes, but if you do change, you've got to stick with it.
And I'm going to, we've got 1 minute, the 3 volumes are privately, well, 2 are out.
2 are out, 1's written. The 3rd is written.
And they're called, the titles?
The first is called St Giles's Fair, the second is called Tiger's Island, and the third is called The Word Spider. They are a mixture of realism and fantasy. It is near the way that they seem to act in my mind in the real world as I can manage. Some of it's crazy, some of it's very realistic. It's really a book about children for adults rather than a book about children for children, though my 2, of course, grew up with it.
On that nice note, I think we'll running right to the last second. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'm sorry to rush you through the last bit.